And so joining us right now are some faces and voices that you will hear throughout this program. We have Maxine Crump, the Executive Director of Dialogue on Race Louisiana. We also have Father Joshua Johnson from Our Lady of the Holy Rosary Catholic Church in Santima, representing the Baton Rouge Diocese of Baton Rouge, as well as Myra Richardson, a young person advocating for change right here in the capital city. I want to thank all of you for being a part of this candid conversation on race virtually with me today. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I really want to start. We've got a lot to talk about and not a lot of time to do it in. And I really want to start by dismantling this idea that we live in a post-racial society, right? Despite the experiences that I think that we all live every single day that tell us otherwise, there are still people who struggle with this idea that racism is still an issue in Louisiana and right here in Baton Rouge. I had a viewer write to me on social media just a few weeks ago saying that we have a black mayor, we have a black police chief, and so the idea that racism is still an issue in the capital city is not an issue. I just want to hear not only your response to that, but how that mindset, and we'll start with Maxine, is really preventing the community from being a community that is equitable for all.
The person who wrote to you about black mayor and all of that, I would guess is someone white. And that's one of the myths of whiteness, is to have the moral elevation to be able to determine when racism has ended. If you are white, you have white privilege, and you're protected from knowing what those who are not white are experiencing. So it is moral elevation, the belief that you get to set the standard, that you get to say when racism has ended, not intentional, but unfortunate, that we have a society that has protected whiteness to the degree that has left the kind of ignorance or lack of knowledge about racism. Because no, racism has not ended, and putting a black person in place does not end racism. In fact, putting a black person in place, the inheritance that they experience from all the history of all the past racism lands on them right then. And then they're often charged with solving it all because their blackness is supposed to do that. That's impossible. So it's not a realistic thought that even anybody who's white can say racism has ended. It is not up to those who are white to determine the end of racism, but it is up to all of us to end it because we've all inherited it.
Absolutely. And Father Josh, I really want to ask you the similar question. I think that you have a pretty unique experience to this conversation, and you bring a different perspective to this conversation. Not only are you one of a few, if not the only African-American priest in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, you also are the son of a former Baton Rouge Police Department captain. So you come from a law enforcement family, and we'll talk about criminal justice here in just a bit, but also you are a faith leader in a community that is fairly religious, that community being South Louisiana in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. So my question to you is, what role does the faith community have in really bringing people toward racial reconciliation?
Well, I think the role that we should have is that should be one of our primary focuses, because Jesus Christ prayed in the Gospel of John chapter 17, and he said, Father, I desire that all may be one. He wants unity among his people. And clearly, at least in our nation's history, there has not been unity amongst all people, primarily because of the sin of racism, right? That's our country's original sin. We had slavery for hundreds of years, and then during Reconstruction, there was racial terrorism that was happening, and racial lynchings against Black people. And then for a number of years, we had Jim Crow laws that were in effect up until the 1960s, which were not that long ago. And then even after the Civil Rights Act, racism continues to be a problem, not only in our nation, but here in Baton Rouge, through practices and policies. Those practices being those unwritten rules that continue to accommodate some people, give access to some people, and deny access to others, discriminate against others, and also those policies, those written rules that continue to, again, accommodate some and deny access to others. And so it's still an issue that Jesus desires for us to address. And when people of faith respond to the desires of Jesus and do address these issues, we see change. An example of that was in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, when Archbishop Alfred Hughes, who was the previous bishop of Baton Rouge a number of years ago, whenever he was in New Orleans, he found out that the Metairie Country Club had a practice that they would not allow any Black people to be members. And when he found out about this practice that was happening at the Metairie Country Club, which was supported by many Catholics in his archdiocese, he wrote a pastoral letter against racism. And in his letter, he said, no Catholic church, school, organization, or institution can hold any events at any institutions that do not allow diverse membership. And when he did this, the country club changed their practice. And so they changed their practice because the church, people in the church actually spoke up and out against this evil, which then brought about a lot of unity amongst the people in his archdiocese who were being negatively affected by these unjust practices and policies. And so I think that it is imperative that all religious leaders respond to the desires of Jesus and the gospel and work with each other to cultivate racial reconciliation, which can only happen whenever there is repentance, when there is reformation, and when there is acts of reparation as well. They all have to go together for us to experience authentic reconciliation, which Jesus Christ desires.
I want to bring in now Myra Richardson, a young person in our community whose voice I really greatly represent. Myra, I will not broadcast your age for our viewers right now, but I'll say that you are doing some great work in the community, far better than what I could have been doing at your age. I really want to talk about this idea, though, of generational racism and some of the systems that are in place, right? You know, you're a young person advocating for change in the community, and there's that saying that, you know, haters will say it's photoshopped. You know, haters might say that you are a young person who has never experienced quote unquote slavery. You are a young person whose parents may not have been born into quote unquote slavery, yet you're out there fighting for some of the systems that continue to perpetuate some of the racism that we see in our community. So what would you say about this fact, this idea that you aren't experiencing some of the things that you're out there fighting for? And what would you say about the young people who are really doing some of the groundwork in our community right now?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for recognizing the work that me and many of my peers are doing. I think I'm just blessed to be a part of the movement, and I think it takes all of us collectively to make it happen. But specifically about your question, I think when people say that slavery was this far removed event, it wasn't. I think that people would like it to be because it's easier for them to accept some of these things or to even more so ignore them. I think that slavery has now manifested itself in a different way. I think that slavery is no longer just publicly lynching people, but it is police brutality against our people. It is seeing people in the streets being murdered in daylight. So no, I do not think that it's different, that it's not slavery in the sense that we're on fields. I think it's slavery in that there are generational crises in terms of our ability to access wealth, equitable education, healthcare. I think that our people are not even just our people. I think this entire community, this is a health crisis for everyone that we should be looking at. This racism is something that affects all of us, whether you are the oppressor or the oppressed. I think that this is something that is a great American sin that we have never yet healed from, or really taken the chance to evaluate and say, how do we move forward from this? I think when we still idolize monuments that were there to entrench a lot of our communities and show them that they were not valuable or validated in our communities. So no, the answer is incorrect. Slavery is still alive. Slavery is still very much so present. And I think it manifests itself in structural racism, which is to answer your previous question. Having a Black mayor, having a Black president, our police chief is Black, having a position of power versus an entire system of oppression is completely different. Having one position for 4 years does not eradicate 400 years of oppression or 400 years of racism, of policies and systems that were meant to make it hard for her to do her job or hard for him to do his job. So I don't think any of these things are one-fit-all solutions, and that we can say just because we've gotten a little progress that we've eradicated all of these issues, because we have yet to truly face them and say this is how we move forward, because we don't want to face them. We don't want to have these tough conversations. And that's why this broadcast right now is so important for everyone to be listening to and to take part in.
It is absolutely an important conversation, and it is a difficult conversation for some people to have because it does take this admittance that, you know, people are not as great as I think that people might seem or think that they are, that, you know, everyone is flawed, and the issue of race and racism is one of those issues that is unfortunately a painful truth to accept. And so, Maxine, I want to go back to you now, to Myra's point about really it taking everyone to get on board with this idea that we need to end this idea of racism or end racism in this community. It's going to take everyone. A conversation that I've had with you in the past, Maxine, has been what does it mean to be an ally, right? And I know that you don't like the word ally because there's a different word that maybe people should use, but as we have these conversations with people and people want to know what they can do to be a quote unquote ally or join the fight and join the cause, what's your take on that?
People start out with the misinformation that you described earlier, thinking that something like post-racial. So to start there means that there's the lack of education. Their lack of education was also institutionally constructed. K through 12 education does not teach accurate history. Myra mentioned 400 years, and that slavery has continued to impact along the way, because after slavery, then there was Jim Crow, 100 years of that. And then a law put in place called Civil Rights Act, which the word there is civil. When the law before that, the Jim Crow laws were criminal laws. And anybody who violated the criminal law, and that would have been those who were former slaves and their descendants, if they crossed the color line, they were immediately arrested. And it was done by policing which has started out as slave catchers to protect the property, which those who were enslaved were considered property, and the slave catcher force became the police force. Still, its targeted job was to focus on those who had been enslaved and their descendants. So when you have a system that continues in place like that, and then after the civil rights law passed, it was a civil law. It only gave those who had been oppressed by slavery and Jim Crow the right to file a lawsuit, which means they had to get an attorney and prove that the institutions had discriminated against them. Now, how when African Americans and those of many others of other colors face racism daily, if they filed a lawsuit every time they experienced racism, the courts would be chock full. They could not get to all the cases. They would have no time for anything else. However, you can imagine that that's not the case, that they don't file a lawsuit, which also leaves the illusion that maybe we're getting better. Seeing Martin Luther King as the guy who was in a nice suit that's made a nice speech of his dream. I want to give you a Martin Luther King message that does not look like what people think Martin Luther King says. Martin Luther King says, and this is something we're talking about ally. People love to use the term ally. They love to use the term peaceful demonstration. This is what King said. He said, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America is not hearing? He says, it has failed to hear that the promise of freedom and justice have not been met, and has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility. They are more concerned about the status quo than about justice and humanity. So what we're looking at is people not having that background. So when they come into dialogue, when they give a definition, their definition of racism, which is something we ask them, give your definition of racism. And they say their definition of racism is when people treat other people less than. Now, there's no subject. There's no they, there's a when. So racism is when something happened. And no, racism is the construction that 400 years ago set people apart as not quite people, and then continued to promise those who were white a superior position in society. And from that superior position, once the slave system ended, then whites said, now, are they going to be just like us? And that's why people say the North won the war, but the South won the peace. Because from there, the nation gave lots of comfort to the South by giving them Jim Crow laws, keeping those who had been enslaved away from the rest of society. And we've never dismantled the system that was put in place. We just gave a civil rights amendment that said, now you can sue if you can prove that they're practicing racism. Well, of course, if the structure's in place, whether their intentions to practice it or not has ended or not, the practice will continue because the structure is there for it to continue.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about the educational structure now with our panel, Father Josh Johnson, Maxine Crump, as well as Myra Richardson, talking about education specifically here in Baton Rouge. And Father Josh, I'll start with you, just looking at education and making sure that all students, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their background, wherever they come from, are able to get an equal and equitable education in a public school system. We all know that the reality is that that is just not happening. So what needs to happen that the educational systems can be more equitable?
That's a great question. Well, I think even with regards to education, I think before we even look at the equity, we need to look at what's being taught in our schools. Who are they learning from? What literature are our kids reading? Who is giving them the history of this country, this nation, our state, and our city? Because even if someone got a quote unquote good education, who's to say it was really that good? Because I think quite often we learn things only from one perspective. So I think that even with regards to education, we need to be looking at what are the resources that our children are being provided with. But education is necessary. Education is something that if we don't have a just system in place, then our kids are not going to have the same opportunities as other people in our society. And currently we aren't seeing that being done on a national level, but even on a local level. And so I think one of the reasons why that happens is because a lot of people don't listen. A lot of people live in their own little bubbles, their echo chambers, and their holy huddles, and they don't hear the reality of what their brothers and sisters in our community are receiving and not receiving. And the only way that all of us can begin to care about what's happening with regards to education in Baton Rouge is if we break out of our holy huddles and begin to listen to every member of our society to become aware of, oh my gosh, I had no idea that you didn't have access to the internet in your schools. You didn't have access to these books. You didn't have access to these, whatever it might be. A lot of people don't know because they haven't ever broken out of their little comfort zone. And so we have to begin by inviting everyone in Baton Rouge area to really fast from speaking and to start listening to other people's experience so they can potentially be motivated to be part of the solution, to fight and to vote for people who are going to bring about a better education system for all of our children and not just some of our children.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a great point there. You say you have to look at what's being taught and who's teaching it. And this is really kind of a rapid question and response I'll ask all of our panelists here. But there is an interesting conversation happening on social media over the past couple of weeks with this idea of education and equity in education, with people asking or just talking about, you know, what grade were you in when you had your first black teacher, your first black male teacher, right? Really driving home that issue that representation matters, even in specifically primary and early childhood education. And so, Father Josh, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Maxine and Myra. Just tell me if you recall the first time that you remember having an African-American teacher or a person of color as a teacher.
Yeah, Mr. Ross at 5th grade, Wildwood Elementary.
Maxine?
All of the teachers.
All of the teachers?
I went to a segregated school.
Okay, there you go. Myra?
My first black teacher was actually when I was in elementary school. My first black male teacher wasn't until I was in middle school. So.
Yeah, absolutely. My first black male teacher wasn't until I got to high school, and I grew up in the third largest public school district in the country, in Chicago. So just really shows you the lack of people of color who are actually in the classrooms, really making sure that some of this stuff is being touched on. And something else that I talked with Superintendent Leslie Brown of the East Baton Rouge Parish School System about recently was school funding, and looking at this idea that really the quality of your education comes down to where you live and if you can pay for it. And that's really because if you look at even the EBR parish budget for the past year, almost 50% of the budget comes from local resources. We're talking about property taxes and sales taxes. So for people who live in North Baton Rouge who don't have a lot of business that's thriving there right now, you know, they're not getting a lot of revenue from, say, sales taxes, whereas a district that's in a different part of the community is really making a lot of their money from those sales taxes. So what do you make of this idea that the quality of the access of your education comes down to where you live?
I think that is so spot on. And I think that we just need to look at the numbers in a lot of situations. For example, Louisiana ranks first in childhood poverty. And I think that's something that we have been reckoned with. And I think a lot of the root causes of our issues, whether it be from racism, whether it be education, whether it be economic development or healthcare, the root cause of a lot of these things are poverty. So I think when we analyze that and we start trying to create solutions to poverty, then we will start getting better education. We will start getting better healthcare, because a lot of these issues aren't just generational. They are manufactured issues that persist in our communities. So when we start to address those issues, then we will have equality, then we will have equity. Because I think the thing above all that not only just our students, but everyone in this community deserves is opportunity. When you give a person opportunity, they can achieve. So I think once we start to prioritize giving people opportunities and access and eliminating poverty, we can start to have serious conversations about justice, serious conversations about moving this community forward. And until then, I don't think these conversations are really meant to solve and create solutions, but just to make us all feel good about ourselves. And I don't think we're prepared to really do the work, but I am willing and I am passionate about being a part of that change. And I'm encouraging everyone to become a part of those conversations about real substantive change.
Well, Myra, you are doing the work. I want to ask Maxine, how do people do the work? Myra's saying, we're all having these conversations, but people might be hesitant to actually get out there and get working. Maxine, how does that happen?
I'm not in a hurry for people to rush out there and get to working. But let me say this: when you asked about, and I'm going to tell you why in a second, but when you asked about education and you looked at property taxes, maybe under the circumstances, since we have this racist structure, property tax should not be how we fund schools, because they're not going to be funded equitably as long as we have poverty and neighborhoods that have been racialized over many years. So the color of our society and where people live has been laid out by land, and then now property taxes are going to fund school. You're not going to have equitable schools until you take a look at how the race set up, and using property tax is another injustice to education. Now, and your question was about people getting out there. Nothing we do in dialogue tells people to get out there and do anything, because what we've recognized is people, when they come to dialogue, they get the kind of information they need to inform their actions. And so whatever they do with the educational aspect of what they get from the dialogue series, they choose their actions. But now they have an informed choice. So many people come in and had not understood the setup. They don't come in good or bad people. And the question I heard you say earlier, people think they're good, but maybe they're not as good as they think they are. Yes, they are. People are as good as they think they are. The thing is, they're not educated. They're not informed. And K through 12 education does not educate them. As you heard Father Josh say, the books, the inaccuracies in our histories, what's left out. And most people don't know that this country became a superpower from a colonial, becoming a country in 1776 to 1802. That slave system, using one commodity, begun to explode between 1802 and 1862. And because of the free forced labor using violence, built this country as the economic power between 1802 and 1862. 60 years, this country forced that much work with one commodity that enriched not only the South, but the North and Great Britain. That's not in the history books. It's a fact. It's not in the K through 12 books. But it's definitely recorded history elsewhere, in great places that can be trusted.
Yeah. And I've only got really one last kind of wrap up thing that I want want everyone to kind of respond to. I know Father Josh has to get out of here in a few minutes, so I don't want to keep you any longer than we have to. But let's see, hold on, let me stop. So now that we have all of this information, right, or now that not even we have this information, but now that these conversations are happening, what needs to happen to move the conversation forward? What needs to happen to make this community, our community, the capital city, and all the cities that make up the Baton Rouge metro area, what needs to happen so that people in this area feel like their lives matter, that there are equal opportunities for everyone, what needs to happen to bring this from just a conversation to actual reality? And I'll start with Father Josh.
I think that we need to sit with listening well, first and foremost, engaging in what already exists, like Dialogue on Race Louisiana, and continue to educate ourselves, like Maxine Crump said, by reading books on our own and watching documentaries, listening to podcasts, and getting plugged into movements that already exist. But then also intentionally, once we understand how racism is operative in the Baton Rouge area, specifically through practices, those unwritten rules and policies, and we can even look at them in swimming pools that are still segregated in our area, in fraternities on some of our college campuses. Like check out LSU. Like just begin to look at LSU right now. Are there any frats that are still having practices that don't allow Blacks to be members? Like find that out. And as you begin to learn and learn by listening to others where there are current practices in place and policies in place, written rules, like in some of our student body handbooks in some of our schools that say Black girls can't have braids, that intentionally they target Black girls and they get them suspended for having braids in their hair. Like it's in the handbook policies for some of our schools. So begin to look at these practices and policies and change them. I think when we see the practices and policies are actually transformed, then we're going to begin to see unity happen in our community. But whenever we allow them to exist, whenever we don't even ask the questions to find out where they're operative, then we're not going to see any kind of transformation happening anytime soon.
And Myra, I have you go ahead and take this. Myra, your response to that. What needs to happen now? What do people need to do to assist in what you're doing?
I think that Maxine was right. Before you get very active and start engaging in these practices, is to make yourself more knowledgeable. I think that if you look even just specifically in Baton Rouge, we have a very rich history from the Baton Rouge bus boycotts that would inspire Martin Luther King. We have just a very, very rich history of first that people just don't understand. And then I think secondly, it's engaging with our business community and our leaders of such that, again, it's economic justice about creating infrastructures, creating opportunities for our local business owners, for our families to be getting on level footing so that they too can afford the things that they need for their family, because poverty is such a prominent issue in this community. And we can't solve any of these issues without making sure everybody has the sustainable amount of income for their families. And then thirdly, I think it comes to representation. It's analyzing our boards, it's analyzing our schools, it's analyzing our companies, organizations, and our leadership structures and saying, is it representative of what the city is compositionally? Does it mirror what our community look like? Does it say that it is a progressive board filled with women, filled with people my age, filled with people of different life experiences? Because I think once you uplift diversity, you can come to more accurate solutions that better serve our community. And that needs to be the priority for every community, about not protecting power, but protecting our people. So I think those are the three key things that I would tell people to do today, is to become more knowledgeable, to seek economic justice for all communities, and most importantly is to uplift diversity and accurate representation of our community.
And Maxine?
These are so hard to answer because there's so much more that needs to be made clear. And I do know that people do want to take action. So I'm going to try to focus on that action that they would like to take. And totally, they must inform themselves. You don't run off and try to do something you don't know what you're doing. But unfortunately, the way race has been handled has been so mythed and misunderstood until people kind of think they know, and that's why they rush off to do something, and they think it's been so long, let's hurry up and do it. So what I'm going to offer is a way to think about it. First off, find out what racism is, and it does start with a subject. It is a structured setup that was done, that begun 400 years ago and continued until it had become entrenched in society as normal. And it was institutionalized. Each institution was given the right to practice this hierarchy of human value. And that has never fully ended. And so it's best if people stop thinking of each other as racist. And that's not the biggest power. That, as painful as that can be, it's not what we're talking about when we talk about racism. Personal prejudice alone does not do the most harm. But people do want to know what they can do about it. So I say it's a set of questions you can ask yourself. You can say, in the environment that I'm in, who is in this picture and who is left out? And why is that? In this environment that I'm in, what do I influence? And what can I do about the way things are here?
It's a personal responsibility that everyone has to take if we want to see the end or at least the progression of some of these issues right here in our community. Maxine Crump from the Dialogue on Race, Father Josh Johnson from Our Lady of the Holy Rosary in Santa Ma, and Myra Richardson. Thank you all for your time. We appreciate you for being a part of this candid conversation on race here in the capital city.